everyone, this is PK Entertainment and we're back again, and here now we have another video for you, and this will be a review of Masters of the Universe Revelation Part 2. Now there will be spoilers throughout this review, so just in case you haven't yet caught up with all the episodes, you can catch up with both Part 2 and Part 1, which are available on Netflix. Now I'm pretty much sure we all know what this series is by now, but just in case anybody's watching who doesn't know, Masters of the Universe is the so-called continuation or spiritual sequel to the classic 1980s animated show. Now Part 1, the first 5 episodes debuted on Netflix on July the 23rd, 2021. And as you all may well be aware, there was so much debate and perceived outrage, many original fans feeling it was very much of a disservice to the original series. Many commented on the supposed false marketing of the show, which indeed indicated that Teela was very much the central stage. We had various denials from showrunner Kevin Smith that was the case. There was certain discourse with certain YouTube channels about this, and then when everybody watched the first part, it was very much deemed that it was indeed a Teela-centric show. We always have the automatic stigma that comes along with these franchise reboots, which would yet again associate that we would see an iconic male lead character being superseded by a female character for the sake of agenda. And you can check out my previous reviews of Part 1, and I will leave them within the links within the description. Now just to recap, at the end of Part 1, we essentially saw Skeletor re-emerging from his spiritual form when he was hiding within Evil-Lyn staff to become the powerful entity known as Skelegod, and he would emerge to threaten to take over all of Eternia. Adam was fatally stabbed by Skeletor, and we all left with a supposed cliffhanger moment as to who would survive the overall emergence of Skelegod. So after all the backlash surrounding Part 1, is Part 2 a much better improvement? Can this appease original fans given a satisfactory conclusion where He-Man once again becomes the forefront of the series? Now sadly I have to say the answer is no. Much like Part 1, Part 2 had potential to be something special, but rushes so much through any real development for the sake of shock or sensationalistic moments. It tries to hype up certain twists and revelations, but they don't carry any weight, and the pace moves around so quickly it leaves you less engaged with the story. And as for the story itself, it's very much more of a build-up to a final battle rather than the journey narrative that we saw within Part 1. It starts off in a very messy and chaotic fashion, picking up from the major cliffhanger from Part 1, with Skelegod sounded very hokey, I must say. I think Mark Hamill, in terms of his voiceover work, kind of felt a bit off during his delivery within this character, but essentially Skelegod was outlining his overall intentions. He stabs the sorceress and essentially replaces her with Evil-Lyn in the main role. Now to be honest, I did like the overall look at Evil-Lyn in terms of her new sorceress outfit. This was highlighted very much so in the trailers. We see them as Adam is revived as we all expected, as he's healed by Teela, who we see overall from the beginning right to the end, her start to emanate her sorceress powers, and this is very much in keeping with the original interpretation where we all know that Teela is destined to be the new sorceress, and that very much plays out throughout these current 5 episodes. Now one big development was the reveal of Savage He-Man. This is essentially He-Man in Incredible Hulk form, where he's more powerful but he's less controlled and coordinated. The main reveal and concept here is that Adam himself is integral to the power of Grayskull and how he has the ability to command it without the sword. Now, as we all know, the original interpretation is that the power sword is very important in terms of commanding the power of He-Man, and I didn't like this new development here because I feel overall it undercuts the value of the sword itself. What's the point of the sword if Adam can somehow have the ability to command He-Man almost at will? It takes away a lot of the tension whenever the sword is lost or is in someone else's possession, so I didn't like that. I think the intention here was to try and add further importance to Adam, but to be honest, the Savage Hulk development doesn't last that long. Essentially he's suppressed when he comes into reconciliation with King Randor, who we know was very absent for the most of Part 1. Now it's at this stage, halfway through the second episode, where the show eventually calms down, and it does give us some potentially interesting character interactions. So we learn that Randor and Molina have effectively become distant and separated following the fallout from the Part 1 finale. We acknowledge now that Man-at-Arms and Sorceress were actually lovers, and this was a major change from the 1980s version and the 2002 reboot where, correct me if I'm wrong, Sorceress fell in love with just a random soldier and we never hear from him again. And this causes quite a continuity issue because we are told constantly through the marketing of this series that it is indeed a sequel or a continuation. But how can that be if indeed Man-at-Arms and Sorceress were lovers here, but in the original they weren't? So this is something of a retcon, I do believe. Again, if I've missed something, then let me know within the comments. But to be honest with you, this is a moment that isn't really referred to again throughout the rest of the story. Now, we do focus a bit in the beginning on Skelegod's overall motivation. He indeed wants to discover the secret of how Adam was able to call the power without the sword, and he's also waiting for the universal event of the celestial apex. This is when all of the planets become aligned together, and Eternia will become the central part of a convergence in many ways within the universe. And this convergence will help Skeletor harness enough power without having to know Adam's secret. Now, this potentially was an interesting part of the story, but it's only mentioned once within this episode and it's never referred to again. So you do wonder why they brought it up in the first place. Now, I mentioned in my review of part 1 that I felt like Evil-Lyn was easily the best character of the show, and in the beginning of part 2, we certainly tap more into her character. Now, in part 1, she was seemingly more conflicted as she was helping the heroes as well as fighting with Skeletor in the earlier part of the story. Now, she's given even more focus here, where we see her trying to define her own purpose in a new role as a sorceress, as well as aligning with Skeletor and constantly finding herself berated and demeaned upon. And this is pointed out to her very much so by Beastman and Man-at-Arms. So we have very much of a conflicting issue here, and we do get some good concentrated time with the character. We further this by giving some backstory as to how Evil-Lyn came into first contact with Skeletor. We learn that she was very much abandoned by her parents, that she had to escape them, and then we see her getting attacked in the village, and then this is when Skeletor randomly shows up in some portals to save her. Now, it's never explained why Skeletor showed up at this moment in time to save Evil-Lyn, but at this point, we're showing a lot of sympathy towards Evil-Lyn. And at the time of watching, I was firmly believing they were actually going to make Evil-Lyn almost the main protagonist of the show. But at this stage, this is where we really see the pivot of part 2 overall, where it potentially becomes something interesting to when it overall turns into something very silly. Now, we get what is really quite a controversial sequence of events when Evil-Lyn comes to realization of her true ambitions, and in order to regain the power of Skelegod, she essentially offers herself in a sexual manner to get Skelegod to relinquish the power of the sword in order for her to obtain it. Now, at the time of watching, I was really wondering how far they were going to take this, because we've had many comments from Kevin Smith relating to how this show is the phrase metal, how it's basically indicating that it's certainly hardcore. It's very much more of a edgier show than what we saw from the 1980s version. So when I was watching this sequence where we see Skeletor touching Evil-Lyn and she's sitting on his lap and they're kissing, again, that didn't really make sense since Skeletor has no lips. But I was really wondering and actually a bit concerned how far they were going to push this moment. This show is of course produced by Netflix and Powerhouse Animation, who also produced the Castlevania, and if you remember, particularly in season 3, we did get a quite explicit sexual encounter in that series, and I was actually worried that they were going to push this scene certainly to the point of what we would very deem inappropriate for a He-Man story, but sadly they didn't. But I just think it's the overall gesture of the show itself, the fact that Evil-Lyn has to sexually offer herself in order to obtain the absolute power. So I think this moment overall really undercuts the value of both Skeletor and Evil-Lyn. Now, yes, in various iterations there are many times when we allude to the fact that Evil-Lyn has the potential to be even more powerful than Skeletor. The 2002 series in particular had a great story arc where we see Evil-Lyn betraying Skeletor to the Snake Men, and we get a very backstory of how they came to prominence and contact together. And over the course of that story, we once again see Evil-Lyn have various ambitions to overturn Skeletor. But within those previous series, they developed that far more, but really here it comes out of the blue. And we've always associated Skeletor as being overall the far superior powerful being in terms of Evil-Lyn. So to see him easily manipulated like this, it really undercut the character. And like I said before, Evil-Lyn normally is a character who's able to use her magic and her savvy and her wits in order to get what she wants. And this is the point for me when part 2 really goes off the rails, because following obtaining a sword of power, Evil-Lyn acquires the ultimate power, and then we get this really horrific looking costumed look where she turns far more into a muscular physique. And it truly is a ridiculous moment, and it makes Evil-Lyn just like Skeletor, because the whole motivation of Evil-Lyn is that she felt Skeletor's motivations were really weak, because Skeletor at the end of the day wants to kill He-Man, and Evil-Lyn berated him with this because she felt there was so much that Skeletor could be doing with the ultimate power. But once Evil-Lyn gets the power, all she does is want to destroy things. We see that moment where she essentially destroys Preternia. Again, all of the characters that we saw in the first arc of part 1 involved in that place we never see again really in this second part. But it makes Evil-Lyn even a less dimensional character than Skeletor. At least we could understand why Skeletor wants to kill He-Man. But once Evil-Lyn has the power, And remember, she had no real intentions to hunt down the previous heroes. All of a sudden, she wants to battle everybody and kill everybody. And at the end, really, when we see Evil-Lyn, she's got all of the power within Castle Grayskull, but she just sits there. She doesn't really do anything. She has no real purpose. We get a bit of back and forth between her and Beastman, but that doesn't really carry any weight. So this development really undercut Evil-Lyn as the main presence, which was a shame because, as I mentioned before, I believed her to be the best character within the show. And it's really at this point when the show overall just descends into fights and battles. We see various emergence of Man-at-Arms reuniting again with Teela, saying how much he's grateful that she's her daughter, and she returns the compliment. We see Andrea be promoted to the role of lieutenant by King Randall. We see the return of Orko, who remember died from the first part. We get various twists and turns later on within the narrative where we see Skeletor actually joining up and aligning with the team in order to fight off against Evil-Lyn. We get other appearances from classic masters such as Ranman as well. But these are just fleeting moments. And again, if you are a major fan of the original version, you're going to be very disappointed that all of these iconic characters really have such diminished roles within the overall series. Now, as we get to the final battle, there's no denying that the battle scenes are spectacular, as what was promised in the trailer. Indeed, as we all suspected, we all knew that these battle sequences would indeed appear in the final episode only. And I can't deny again the animation, which is without question the best part of this entire series. It's absolutely stunning. The way that the characters are drawn, we see all of them shooting laser beams. And in terms of the scale of the scope of the animated show, you can't deny it. It truly is an impressive production. Now, we talk about Teela, and as I mentioned before, there was so much controversy surrounding her in part 1. I think overall, my main issue was previously is that she's very unlikable and she's very complacent. Overall, she's always blaming everybody for her own different situations. Now, in part 2, admittedly, she wasn't quite as complacent or unlikable this time around. And to be honest, she's not really as prominent. Yes, we get further hints as the future sorceress, but she's not really the driving character this time around. And I think that's one thing we could credit about this time, is that it did kind of share the involvement with the other supporting characters. But as usual, when everything comes to a halt, we would see Teela come to the forefront, and we do see her eventually be converted into the new sorceress. And once again, in terms of stunning animation, the scenes where she comes into contact with Sorceress and she engages the final power are very great and beautiful to look at. And essentially, the final conflict does determine between her and Evil-Lyn. And let's be honest here, I believe that was the overall focus very much from episode 1 throughout the show. Now, overall, we see them flying in the air and exhibiting various powers. But because everything is moving so quick at this point, we really are traversing across multiple characters, all coming across one another. So again, this fight doesn't really carry any weight to it. And at the conclusion, they tried to build up some sort of moment of redemption for Evil-Lyn, where we see the universe really converging itself, and then Evil-Lyn helps Teela in order to stop it. It didn't really have any significant impact in terms of the overall climax. Now, if you stayed watching throughout this stage of the review, you're probably thinking, why have I not mentioned He-Man yet? Well, that's simply because He-Man is barely in this show. He appears for what must be a total of around 3 minutes in total in the final battle only. Adam reclaims the sword, and then we see him fighting alongside Skeletor against Evil-Lyn. We get a predictable twist at the end when Skeletor turns around and fights against He-Man. Again, the final battle is over so quickly. He-Man throws Skeletor into the distance, and then that's essentially it. So once again, if you are an original He-Man fan, it all but confirms what we already knew at the beginning, that this is not a He-Man show. It never was a He-Man show. And I think that's overall very disappointing, because I think there's huge potential here. I do think Chris Wood did voice the character very well, and I liked the way that the character was drawn. But to not have He-Man barely in it, it was one thing, at least in part 1, he was in the beginning of the episode and then came through at the end. But this time, to not have him barely in it, I think it's very insulting for any fans who are so immersive in the character, because we don't know yet whether we will get another He-Man show. And if we do, will it be true to the character itself? So to only bring him in at the end, I think was very disappointing overall. But in terms of the story, that's when eventually everything wraps up. So we see Adriana becoming the new Man-at-Arms. We see Adam, Randall and Melina coming together again. We see Teela becoming the new sorceress, and she's gained the ability to be able to exist outside the confines of Castle Grayskull. We see Evil-Lyn retrieving to, I think it's Preternia, She throws away her style, so this is the ultimate final act of redemption for her character. And then we get to the end credit scene where we see Skeletor, who has arrived back in Triclops Fortress, who again, that was another character that we didn't see from part 1. He has the intentions of taking over, but then when he strikes down the monument that they've been worshipping, we see like a female cyborg built in by nanotechnology emerge from the statue, and she essentially, it looks like she assimilates Skeletor with all of these tubes. And the end part is when we see the Hordak signal appear at her forehead. Now, for anybody who knows, Hordak is probably the second most iconic villain within all of the He-Man franchise. He primarily has a role within the She-Ra television show, but overall he is deemed the most powerful in both the 1980s version and especially the 2002 version. Skeletor is much more of a subordinate of Hordak, and it was a very shame in the 2002 that they didn't get to do a season 3 because Hordak was going to very much take centre stage. So is that what they intend to do here with season 2, if we indeed get a season 2? Now, should they do a season 2? Now, to be honest, I'm very conflicted like this. As a fan, I will only really accept a season 2 if indeed we do see He-Man very much now at the forefront. We've established Teela's arc now. We've gone through the whole journey of watching her acclaim the power of the sorceress. So really, if we are going to get a season 2, surely now, if Kevin Smith is still the showrunner, that we would surely have He-Man now back at the forefront. And on the one hand, we could say any season 2 would have an interesting dynamic because a lot of the established characters have been gone. There's no more Evil-Lyn. We assume there's no more Beastman. We assume there's no more Skeletor. If we're very much hinting that Hordak will indeed emerge as the secondary villain. We know that Man-at-Arms now has taken a backseat, so Adriana has now become the new Man-at-Arms. So season 2, in theory, should have much more of a fresher feel, where it really becomes its own identity in many ways, rather than having to hinge on it connecting with the 1980 show. So this could have very good results if the writing is done right, and that's the massive if, and that's the overall problem, because for me, I don't think Masters of the Revelation as the show has been a really big success. I actually think perhaps maybe part 1 was better than part 2. Another example of a major studio not really fully appreciating the value of the IP that they have, not really understanding the mythological aspects, all of the lore, all of the history, all of the huge potential in terms of a He-Man franchise. I truly believe if done right, He-Man could be a live action franchise on the same scale as Lord of the Rings, with science fiction elements of course added. But I don't think Netflix really appreciated this overall. I do believe it was just a case of they have this IP and they wanted to get lots of viewers in a short space of time. And what we've seen certainly with the end of part 2, that there was very little discussion or trending. I almost forgot that it was actually broadcast at this time, and that's telling in itself. Obviously part 1 garnered a lot of traction, but a lot of that was negative, so hardly any people really returned for this second part. So once again, I am suspicious as to whether we will indeed get a part 2. I do believe they should have released all 10 episodes at once, but we will wait and see if we do indeed get a part 2. We've had many examples of Netflix where they do leave cliffhangers, but season 2 never arrives. So I wouldn't be certain as we do get a second season of Masters of the Universe, but if indeed we do, I want to see He-Man far more at the forefront. I want to see far more fresher and original storylines with more villains. Maybe we can use Hordak in some capacity, but if we do, make sure that he has a huge threatening level. I don't believe we will see She-Ra appear because maybe that will conflict with the DreamWorks Netflix show as well, and who knows, maybe they will introduce a separate She-Ra series down the line. I'm not sure. They'll probably will wait and see how successful season 2 is overall, but we'll wait and see what happens in the future in terms of the fate of Masters of the Universe Revelation. So those are my overall thoughts and feelings and spoiler review of Masters of the Universe Revelation Part 2. Let me know what you think in the comments below. How do you think it compares to Part 1 and indeed the 1980 show and also the 2002 show? Do you think this has been for the most part a futile exercise? Do you think they could have done it better? Do you think He-Man still potentially has the opportunity to be a successful franchise amongst modern day audiences, or do you think it should have been left alone altogether? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Please also hit and like the subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very soon.